The rain had just started to fall when 38-year-old Daniel Mercer pulled into the driveway of the old family home, the house his father had built with his own hands nearly 4 decades earlier. The evening sky hung low and heavy, the kind of gray that settled into bone and memory alike. From the cracked walkway to the warped front door, nothing looked the way it had when Daniel was a child. Something about the quiet was wrong, too still, too hollow, as if the house itself sensed what had been taken from it. Reports later described him as disoriented, standing at the threshold with a folded letter in one hand, the letter that had summoned him back from 2 states away. Inside, the stale warmth drifted out like a sigh. And yet, in the silence, there was the unmistakable knowledge that this was no longer his father's home. Not anymore. The truth was hiding in plain sight, tucked between the faint smells of dust and forgotten dinners, waiting to be exposed. But it wouldn't be a sudden revelation. It would arrive the way betrayal often does, quietly at first, then roaring, sweeping through every memory, every promise, every moment of trust earned over a lifetime. And in that moment, as Daniel stepped inside and saw the empty living room, the missing furniture, the bare floors, he felt the weight of something far darker than abandonment. His father was dying, his stepbrother had vanished, and the deed to the house worth $2.1 million was nowhere to be found. Before we go deeper into this chilling case, take a moment and tell us something different tonight. What was the last family promise you ever believed would never be broken? As we unravel this story, share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more investigations that peel back the hidden betrayals families try to bury, you can support this channel simply by watching closely and engaging when something strikes you. Your voice keeps these stories alive long after the secrets themselves are exposed. Years before the betrayal surfaced, before lawyers circled like quiet vultures, and before hospice nurses whispered updates in dim hallways, the Mercer family looked like any other blended household fighting to make things work. Their father, Thomas Mercer, had remarried in his late 40s after losing his first wife to illness. The woman he chose, Angela, was warm, soft-spoken, and came with a teenage son named Jacob. At first, the dynamics were fragile. Daniel was 16, Jacob 13, and both boys fought silently for the same space, the right to call Thomas Dad. Neighbors would later recall that the Mercer home always felt a little too quiet after the remarriage, as if an unspoken line had been drawn through the middle of the house. But Thomas believed firmly in fairness. He provided for both boys, paid for their school trips, and never once allowed the word step to determine anything of value. Reports suggest he even toyed with the idea of adopting Jacob, though the paperwork was never finalized. Angela passed away unexpectedly 5 years after the marriage, leaving Thomas to raise Jacob through the end of high school. By then, Jacob held more influence than anyone realized. While Daniel left for college with scholarships and part-time jobs, Jacob stayed close, drifting between community classes and odd jobs, but always returning home. He was the one who knew where everything was, a family friend later said. He kept all the keys. The home itself became a symbol of the family's story. Seated on the crest of a hill overlooking a stretch of wooded land, it was the kind of property that would eventually explode in value as the city expanded. Contractors had begun eyeing the area even before Thomas reached retirement age. But to him, it wasn't an investment. It was memory. The place where he had first brought his children home from the hospital, where he'd marked their heights on the doorframe, where he'd kept every holiday photograph taped to the refrigerator. And that emotional connection, that deep, almost sacred love for the home, would later be the very thing used against him. The timeline of the betrayal begins quietly, nearly 10 years before Daniel would find the house empty. Thomas's health had been declining, not dramatically at first, but enough for Jacob to help out more around the property. He handled repairs, ran errands, and gradually positioned himself as the indispensable son. Reports suggest that by the time Thomas received his diagnosis, a degenerative condition that affected his balance and memory, Jacob had all but integrated himself into every corner of the elder Mercer's daily life. Daniel, now living several states away for work, visited as often as he could, but Jacob controlled most of the communication. "Dad's fine," he would say. "He's resting. No need to fly down right now." There was no reason for Daniel not to believe him, but years later, investigators would discover something chilling. Jacob had transferred himself onto key financial accounts, acting as a temporary co-owner with signatures that appeared to belong to Thomas. Whether those signatures were coerced, guided, or forged remains a point of contention, with handwriting analysts arriving at inconsistent conclusions. Yet the pattern was clear. The closer Thomas drifted toward physical vulnerability, the more access Jacob obtained. And the more access he obtained, the deeper he reached, until he held not just the bank cards, but the trust that would enable the betrayal itself. As the diagnosis progressed, Thomas became increasingly dependent on medication and help with mobility. Reports suggest that Jacob was the one who refilled prescriptions, managed doctor appointments, and even began screening calls. "Let Dad sleep," he would text. "He gets confused easily." In many families, that level of assistance would be an act of love. In this family, it was the beginning of quiet isolation. Then came the year everything tipped. At the start of that year, land development companies began offering astronomical prices for properties on the hill. The Mercer home, with its prime location, appraised at $2.1 million, a figure that would have stunned the Thomas of 20 years earlier. Whether he ever fully understood the value remains uncertain. What is known is that around the same time, neighbors noticed unusual visitors, men in dress shirts walking the perimeter, measuring, pointing, returning in the evenings. One neighbor would later recall, "I assumed they were contractors. I didn't know they were buyers." Meanwhile, Daniel received fewer updates, and when he did manage to speak with his father, the conversations were disjointed. Thomas would ask the same question twice, sometimes forgetting entire topics halfway through a sentence. "Your brother's helping with everything," he said once. "He knows what to do." Daniel hadn't thought much of it then. He didn't realize that the phrase "knows what to do" would one day haunt him. The sale itself remains one of the most calculated steps in the entire timeline. According to records reviewed later by investigators, Jacob arranged meetings with real estate representatives without notifying Daniel or any extended family. He accompanied Thomas to a notary office. Witnesses recall that Thomas appeared tired and quiet, answering questions with vague nods. When the deed transfer was signed, the buyer reportedly asked if Thomas understood the full transaction. "My son explained it," he allegedly murmured. "He knows what he's doing." It was a sentence that would become the cornerstone of the legal battle that followed. Weeks later, the check, $2.1 million, was deposited into an account that bore only two names, and one of those names would be removed shortly afterward. When Daniel finally received the letter that summoned him home, he didn't know that the account was already drained. He didn't know the house had been sold, that contractors were scheduled to break ground within weeks, or that his stepbrother had quietly purchased a new home under a separate LLC. What he knew was simple. Something felt wrong, and when he stepped inside the empty house, the hollow echo of his footsteps confirmed what his instincts had already whispered. The truth was about to be exposed. But the betrayal didn't end at the missing furniture or the stripped bare rooms. In a back bedroom, Daniel found medication bottles scattered across the floor. His father's medical records were gone, his stepbrother's belongings were gone, and worst of all, his father, frail, confused, and frightened, was nowhere in the home. That was the moment the timeline split. The moment a worried son transformed into something else. A man determined to uncover whatever had been done behind closed doors. Because betrayal leaves traces even when the betrayer tries to bury them. And the first trace Daniel found was a crumpled receipt in the kitchen trash, dated just days earlier. A hospice facility. An address he had never heard of. A signature he did not recognize. The investigation, the unraveling, was about to begin. Daniel drove to the hospice facility listed on the discarded receipt, guided only by the glow of streetlights in the gnawing certainty that something irreversible had happened. The building sat at the edge of town, tucked behind a row of silent trees. It looked nothing like the kind of place his father would have chosen for himself, or the kind of place a loving son would have chosen for him. Inside, the air felt thick with disinfectant and the soft hum of machinery. At the front desk, a tired night nurse glanced up at Daniel with a kind of practiced detachment. But when he gave his father's name, something in her expression tightened, just slightly. Not surprise, caution. She led him down a quiet hallway, her shoes whispering across the floor. At the third door, she paused before opening it, almost as though bracing him for what he was about to see. When the door swung inward, Daniel felt his breath catch. His father lay curled slightly on one side, his frame smaller, thinner than Daniel remembered. His breathing was shallow. The room was too cold, too empty. And sitting on the bedside table, tucked between a water pitcher and a clipboard, was a printed notice that made Daniel's stomach twist. Responsible party, Jacob Mercer. The night nurse spoke softly as if afraid the truth itself might fracture the air. He hasn't had many visitors, she said. Your brother was here 3 days ago. Signed paperwork. After that, no one. Daniel didn't speak. He pulled a chair close to the bed, took his father's hand, and waited for him to stir. When Thomas finally opened his eyes, there was a flicker of recognition, then confusion. Dan, he whispered, they said you were busy. Said I shouldn't worry you. It was that sentence, quiet, fragile, that burned its way into Daniel's memory, because it confirmed everything. Confirmed that Jacob had kept him away. Confirmed that their father had been isolated. Confirmed that the betrayal went far deeper than property or signatures. It reached into the very heart of their family, the trust that should have protected a man in his final months. Over the next hours, as rain pattered against the window, Daniel pieced together fragments of what had happened. His father remembered meetings, papers, his son's voice guiding him, telling him what to sign, what to agree to, what was best for everyone. He remembered being tired, too tired to argue. He remembered being told that Daniel was handling his own life and didn't need the burden. And then he remembered nothing, just waking up in a hospice bed without understanding how he had arrived there. By morning, Daniel had made two decisions. He would stay by his father's arm, and he would uncover every detail of what his stepbrother had done. The investigation began quietly. A call to the county clerk's office, a request for property transfer documents, a review of public land records. What he uncovered made his hands shake. The deed had been transferred 6 months earlier. The signatures were there, witnessed, stamped, legal. But the notary's remarks included a detail that changed everything. Signer appeared frail, responded minimally, guidance provided by accompanying party. That accompanying party, of course, was Jacob. From there, the paper trail only grew darker. Banking records showed large withdrawals in the weeks after the sale, transfers into an LLC account that investigators later described as deliberately confusing, credit applications, vehicle purchases, and then, the final blow, a newly purchased home under a corporate shell, all tied back to the money taken from the Mercer property. But documents were only the beginning. When Daniel confronted the hospice staff in the days that followed, he learned something even more unsettling. According to an intake nurse, Jacob had arrived alone, exhausted, claiming that his father's condition had worsened suddenly, that he needed immediate placement, that family would understand later. He signed the necessary forms, left a payment card on file, and then disappeared. There was no contact number, no updates, no visits. And this was where investigators would later say the betrayal became most evident, not in the theft itself, but in the abandonment that followed. As Thomas grew weaker, Daniel faced a grim ticking clock. He stayed with his father every day, watching as the man who had once built houses with his hands now struggled to lift a glass of water. Yet even in those fragile moments, Thomas tried to piece together the truth. "Where's your brother?" he asked once, voice barely a whisper. He said he'd handle everything. But the truth had already been exposed, at least to Daniel. And now all that remained was the path forward. Legal, emotional, irreversible. The detectives assigned to the case approached it with caution. Property theft of this magnitude, especially involving a potentially vulnerable adult, required delicate examination. Forensic accountants combed through transfers, matching dates with medical appointments and signs of cognitive decline. Statements were taken. Witnesses interviewed. Even the notary who oversaw the sale was called in, providing an account that raised more questions than answers. "He didn't seem aware," she said. "I remember thinking something felt off." In another home across town, shielded behind locked gates and new construction, Jacob was living a life built on the ruins of someone else's trust. According to reports, he continued working his part-time job as if nothing had happened. Neighbors later described him as quiet, private, the kind of man who looked over his shoulder even when no one was behind him. When investigators first approached, he denied everything, claimed the sale was consensual, claimed Thomas understood, claimed Daniel was just angry about the inheritance. But facts have a way of cornering the truth. The case escalated when a handwriting analyst declared that several signatures showed indications of guidance, meaning a hand may have been physically assisted. While not conclusive on its own, it added weight to the growing suspicion that the property transfer had been engineered under duress. Then came the breaking point. A hospice nurse stepped forward, providing a written statement that she overheard Thomas say, during a moment of distress, "I never agreed to sell my house. Why did he take me from home?" Though legally complicated, the emotional impact of this statement rippled through every part of the investigation. With mounting evidence, the state opened a formal inquiry into financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. The case drew attention, not because of violence or spectacle, but because it reflected something deeply unsettling: how quietly betrayal can unfold when trust is weaponized. But fate would deliver its own cruel timing. Just as the case gained traction, Thomas's health took a final downturn. Daniel was there in his last hours, holding his father's hand as the machine slowed. And with his final breath, Thomas whispered the words that would define the rest of Daniel's life. "I'm sorry, I trusted him." The funeral was small, quiet, attended by neighbors who had watched the Mercer boys grow up. Jacob did not attend. His absence was its own confession. In the weeks after the burial, the legal battle intensified. Prosecutors pursued charges related to exploitation and fraudulent transfer. Civil suits were filed, but the advantage always leaned toward Jacob. The paperwork existed, the signatures were there, and the law often struggles to navigate betrayal that hides behind the appearance of consent. Years would pass before the final rulings were delivered. Some funds were recovered, though never the full amount. Courts determined that part of the sale had been improperly influenced, but not entirely invalid. The home was already demolished, the land already built upon, the memories already erased us. But justice, imperfect as it was, came in the form of accountability. Jacob faced penalties, financial restitution orders, and long-term restrictions. His reputation collapsed. His newfound life dissolved under the weight of legal fees. And the home he purchased with stolen money was seized. Yet none of it, Daniel later said, brought him peace, because betrayal doesn't simply take what you own. It takes what you believed, what you trusted, what you thought you knew about family. And for Daniel, the real loss wasn't the house or the inheritance. It was the realization that his father died believing he had failed to protect the son he thought he could trust. Sometimes the darkest crimes aren't committed with weapons, threats, or violence. They're committed with signatures, with silence, with the quiet manipulation of someone too weak to defend themselves. And when the truth is finally exposed, all that remains are the questions we ask ourselves when the lights go out. How well do we ever truly know the people closest to us? And how many betrayals begin not with hatred, but with opportunity? The Mercer case leaves behind a legacy not of wealth or justice, but of caution. A reminder that inheritance can become a battlefield, that trust can be twisted, that family can fracture under the weight of greed, and that the human heart, fragile as it is, can be broken long before the law steps in. What happened in that home, the home built with love, stolen with paperwork, lost forever, still haunts the community. Some say justice was incomplete. Others say it was the best the system could offer. But all agree on one thing: the story serves as a warning about silence, a warning about vulnerability, a warning that even the strongest families can crumble when one person decides that loyalty is worth less than money. And in the end, the betrayal was exposed, but the damage was done. Before we close this case, consider this. Trust isn't always destroyed in a single moment. Sometimes it fades one decision at a time until the truth finally breaks through. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts below. Your insight keeps these investigations alive and gives voice to families who lost far more than property. And if you want more stories that pull back the curtain on hidden betrayals and quiet crimes, stay with us. There are many more secrets still waiting to be brought into the light.